Tehran's taps were never supposed to run dry. For decades, Iranians were told that new dams, canals and grand engineering projects would tame the country's harsh climate and secure food and water for generations. Now, in late 2025, those same systems are failing all at once, and the consequences are starting to look like something far bigger than a seasonal drought. Across Iran, a phrase keeps coming up from scientists, officials and international observers: water bankruptcy. It's not a slogan. It's a diagnosis, the idea that Iran has used more water than nature can ever replace, and that the bill is finally coming due. One United Nations environmental expert has described Iran's situation as a state of water bankruptcy, warning that it could cripple infrastructure and undermine the country's stability. This is not just a story about dry rivers and empty dams. It's about a country of more than 85 million people, where millions are now living with the daily fear that the water might simply stop, and where a collapse in water supplies in just a few key regions could push up to 10 million people into a life-threatening emergency. To understand how Iran got here, you have to go back decades. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, successive governments pushed a powerful idea: Iran should be self-sufficient in food. To get there, they poured money into agriculture, subsidizing water-intensive crops, fertilizers and farm loans, and encouraging farmers to expand irrigated land even in some of the driest parts of the country. On paper, it looked like progress. New dams rose across major rivers. Canals were dug to move water from one basin to another. Groundwater, once treated as a strategic reserve to be used sparingly, became a routine source of irrigation. Legal wells multiplied, and then illegal wells exploded in number. Around Lake Urmia alone, experts estimate more than 70,000 illegal wells have been drilled, sucking out groundwater far faster than it can be replaced. For a while, the costs were easy to ignore. Rainfall was never generous, but there were still wet years. As long as taps still ran in Tehran and other big cities, it was tempting to believe that technology and engineering could outrun nature. That belief has now collided with a harsher reality: a long, punishing drought, years of below-average rainfall, and rising temperatures driven by climate change. Iran has lost a huge share of its surface water over the past 2 decades, and its once reliable snowpack in the mountains is shrinking. The result is visible across the map. Lakes like Urmia, once the largest saltwater lake in the Middle East, have almost disappeared. Wetlands such as Hamoun, Baktagan, Parishan and Gavkuni have shrunk or dried out completely. Land subsidence, literally the ground sinking as aquifers are drained, is damaging buildings, roads and pipelines. One analyst put it starkly, saying Iran's water bankruptcy is the prime mover in a devastating chain reaction, a hydrological disaster whose effects are destroying the foundations of the nation's critical infrastructure. In other words, the crisis doesn't stop at empty reservoirs. It spreads into the power grid, transport, industry, and the basic services that keep a modern country functioning. The most alarming symbol of this crisis is the capital itself. Tehran and its sprawling metropolitan area depend on a network of dams and reservoirs in the mountains. Those dams are now operating at minimal capacity. Some are down to just a few % of their reserves. In the heat of the 2025 summer, as temperatures soared above 50 degrees Celsius in some regions, Iran's authorities did something extraordinary. They declared public holidays in Tehran to cut electricity demand, closed offices and urged citizens to save both power and water. At the same time, rolling power cuts hit much of the country, in some places lasting up to 10 hours a day, because hydropower plants simply didn't have enough water to generate electricity. Officially, there have been few large-scale announced water cuts in Tehran, but behind the scenes, the situation is tight. Dam reserves nationwide have fallen by more than a quarter compared with the previous year, and the main dams feeding the capital have hovered near critical levels, with one key dam reported at just around 12% of capacity during the summer. Residents describe taps running at low pressure, entire neighbourhoods going without water for long stretches, and people rushing to fill storage tanks whenever the supply comes on. Some households keep buckets permanently lined up in bathrooms and courtyards in case the water disappears with no warning. Environmental experts warn that if even one major reservoir system fails in summer peak demand, the government could be forced into emergency measures, including partial evacuations of parts of the capital region. No one wants to say that publicly, but privately, officials and analysts alike admit that a full breakdown in Tehran's water supply would amount to a national emergency affecting roughly the population of an entire small country, potentially 10 million people facing a sudden life-threatening struggle for drinking water, sanitation and basic hygiene. The water crisis is not confined to Tehran. It's spread across much of the country from the northwest to the southeastern provinces. In the west, lakes and springs that once drew visitors and supported local economies have collapsed. Sarab Nilufar, a famous lake near Kermanshah, once celebrated for its blue water and lotus flowers, now lies dry and cracked. Provincial officials have openly blamed illegal wells, excessive irrigation and falling rainfall for the lake's collapse. In the south and east, towns repeatedly endure days where temperatures climb above 50 degrees Celsius, pushing both power and water systems past their limits. Authorities have appealed to citizens to cut water use, even as households report outages lasting more than 12 hours at a time. One of the most outspoken voices on this crisis is Kaveh Madani, a prominent Iranian environmental expert. Speaking about Tehran's expansion into arid areas and the over-reliance on dams and water transfers, he warned that building ever more infrastructure without changing consumption patterns or governance is a dead end. As he put it, we are not only seeing water bankruptcy, but also energy bankruptcy, natural gas bankruptcy, a warning that Iran is hitting ecological and resource limits on multiple fronts at once. This is the dangerous feedback loop Iran now faces. Less water in dams means less hydropower. Less hydropower forces more reliance on gas-fired plants. Heat waves push electricity demand to run air conditioning and pumps. Power cuts hit the very systems that move and treat water. The end result: taps stop, pumps fail, and everyday life grinds to a halt. Water in Iran today is no longer just a technical issue for engineers or a topic for environmental conferences. It has become a political and security question. International analysts and a top UN environmental expert have warned that Iran's water crisis could undermine its stability and weaken its regional standing. The fear is not just unrest over water cuts, though protests by farmers and residents over dry rivers and dusty riverbeds have already happened in multiple provinces in recent years, but a broader erosion of trust in state institutions. When a government can no longer reliably provide something as basic as drinking water, people start to question everything else: economic management, fairness between provinces, and even who gets water and who doesn't. Water also intersects with other tensions. In some areas, disputes over rivers cross borders, for example, with Afghanistan, where upstream dams affect the flow of water into eastern Iran. Inside Iran, competition between agriculture, cities and industry is intensifying, with each sector lobbying for priority access to a shrinking resource. Urban elites, farmers in traditional heartlands and poorer rural communities are all feeling the squeeze. As aquifers are drained and land subsidence causes damage, some villages have already seen wells fail completely. Families are forced either to buy trucked-in water at high prices or to leave altogether and move to overcrowded cities that are themselves running out of water. In that sense, water is quietly reshaping Iran's internal map, pushing people away from places that are becoming unlivable and concentrating them in urban centres that may not be able to sustain them much longer. Iran's political leadership has begun to speak more openly about the gravity of the crisis. President Masoud Pezeshkian, who took office in 2024 and is now the country's current president, has publicly framed climate and resource issues as a threat to national survival. In the context of the summer heat and reservoir collapse, he reportedly warned that delay in addressing the crisis could lead to irreversible consequences for Iran. Authorities have taken some short-term steps, declaring public holidays in extreme heat to curb power demand, urging citizens to cut water use by around 20%, exploring water import arrangements from neighbouring countries like Turkmenistan and Afghanistan, tightening some rules on illegal well drilling and imposing restrictions on certain crops in water-stressed areas. But environmental experts argue that these measures barely scratch the surface. The core problem, they say, lies in decades of policy decisions that encouraged water-intensive agriculture, underpriced water, allowed widespread illegal wells and shielded politically sensitive sectors from reform. Shutting off thousands of illegal wells means confronting powerful landowners and networks that have benefited from cheap water. Reducing cultivation of thirsty crops threatens jobs in rural areas already hit by sanctions and economic stagnation. Raising water tariffs risks public anger at a time when living costs are already high. Inside the government, there is also a tension between short-term political survival and long-term ecological survival. Serious water reform takes years to show results, and it often requires leaders to impose pain now for benefits that may only become visible in the next decade. That's a hard sell in any country. It is even harder in a political system under economic pressure, facing international sanctions and dealing with other security shocks. Beyond policy debates and expert warnings, Iran's water crisis is being lived by ordinary people in thousands of small daily ways. In some Tehran neighborhoods, families have reorganized their entire routines around water. Showers are timed to coincide with the few hours when pressure is strongest. Buckets are kept under leaky taps to capture every drop. Children are told not to flush toilets unless absolutely necessary. In rural areas, farmers watch fields turn to dust as wells fail. Some switch to less thirsty crops. Others simply abandon their land and move to nearby towns to look for alternative work. Traditional ways of farming that once depended on seasonal rains and small streams are collapsing under the strain of back-to-back dry years and higher temperatures. Women, often responsible for managing household water and caring for children and the elderly, bear a disproportionate share of the stress. When water cuts hit, they are the ones hauling containers, rationing supplies and finding ways to maintain hygiene in cramped apartment buildings or makeshift housing. Doctors are also sounding the alarm. When water is scarce and temperatures are extreme, the risks of dehydration, heat stroke and waterborne diseases rise sharply, especially for older people and young children. Power cuts that shut down refrigerators and medical equipment add another layer of danger for those with chronic illnesses. For many Iranians, this is what water bankruptcy looks like in practice, not an abstract concept, but an exhausting, grinding struggle to hold on to a normal life. So where does the figure of 10 million people facing a deadly water collapse come in? Analysts warn that if water systems in just a handful of major regions fail simultaneously, for example, parts of the greater Tehran area, heavily populated provincial capitals and some key agricultural zones, the number of people pushed into acute crisis could rapidly climb into the tens of millions. The risk is not necessarily that all taps go completely dry overnight across the entire country. It's that several critical systems already running at the edge could be tipped into failure by another year of below-average rainfall, a particularly intense heat wave, a technical failure in a dam, aqueduct or major pumping station, cross-border disputes further affecting inflows from neighbouring states. In those circumstances, even a partial collapse in one region would trigger knock-on effects, internal migration, greater pressure on neighbouring cities, and a surge in demand for emergency supplies. That, in turn, stretches already strained logistics systems and could ignite local unrest. Water experts emphasise that Iran still has options to avoid the worst outcomes, but only if the country moves quickly and decisively. Most serious analyses of Iran's water crisis converge on the same set of long-term solutions. Radically reforming agricultural policy. This means shifting away from water-hungry crops in arid regions, reducing subsidies that encourage overuse, and investing in modern irrigation. It also means accepting that some land will have to be retired from cultivation permanently. Cracking down on illegal wells for real, closing tens of thousands of unlicensed wells, is politically costly and technically difficult. But without it, aquifers cannot recover. Enforcement has to be consistent, not selective. Repricing water to reflect scarcity. Underpriced water has encouraged waste at every level. Gradually raising prices while protecting the poorest households with targeted support is one way to push heavy users, particularly large farms and industries, to change behaviour, investing in efficiency and repair, not just new mega projects. Instead of betting on new dams and grand transfers, Iran needs to fix leaks, modernise networks and reduce losses in distribution. In some cities, a large share of water is lost before it even reaches consumers. Planning for climate reality. Climate change means Iran will face more frequent droughts and heat waves. Infrastructure, urban planning and emergency systems all have to be redesigned with this in mind. None of this is easy. It requires money, political capital, and a willingness to challenge powerful interests. It also demands transparency. People are far more likely to accept hard reforms if they understand the true state of the crisis and see that everyone, including politically connected sectors, is sharing the burden. Iran's leaders often talk about threats from outside: sanctions, regional rivals, geopolitical pressure. But increasingly, some of the most serious warnings are coming from within its own borders and from its own environment. The drying of lakes, sinking of land, and emptying of reservoirs are not distant dangers. They are visible now. In the words of one leading expert, we are not only seeing water bankruptcy, but also energy bankruptcy, natural gas bankruptcy, a sign that multiple systems are reaching their limits together, and that the old model of development can no longer be stretched any further. President Masoud Pezeshkian has acknowledged that failing to act could have irreversible consequences for Iran. The question is whether his administration and the broader political system can move beyond emergency measures and begin the painful process of structural reform before the next shock hits. For now, millions of Iranians are living on the edge of that uncertainty. Each dry tap, each power cut, and each empty reservoir is a reminder that this is not a far-off hypothetical disaster. It is a slow-motion collapse that is already underway, and whether it finally engulfs 10 million people or far more depends on what Iran does in the critical years just ahead.